They said the old woman no longer recognized her own son, yet every night at exactly 3 o'clock she reached for the same voice, and the most feared man in the city stood in silence, watching a miracle he could neither buy nor command. On the 42nd night, the halls of the Castellano estate felt quieter than ever before. The sprawling mansion overlooked the Hudson River, its limestone walls glowing faintly beneath the silver wash of the moon, while antique grandfather clocks measured each passing second with relentless precision. Every employee knew the rules after midnight. No unnecessary footsteps, no conversations above a whisper, and above all, no one entered Mrs. Eleanor Castellano's room after 3 in the morning. The order had existed for nearly 2 years, ever since the illness had stolen the memories of the elegant woman who had once hosted charity galas, played classical piano for distinguished guests, and remembered every birthday of every employee who served under her roof. Now she barely recognized the faces around her. Some nights, she believed she was 25 again. Other nights, she searched endlessly for her husband, calling his name into empty darkness until exhaustion overtook her. Doctors had come from Boston, New York, and even overseas. Specialists filled shelves with medications and recommendations. Expensive machines quietly monitored every heartbeat beside her bed. Yet nothing stopped the ritual that arrived with cruel consistency every morning at 3. Except one thing. Naomi Carter adjusted the simple navy cardigan over her shoulders before quietly opening Mrs. Eleanor's bedroom door. She carried nothing in her hands. No medicine, no equipment, no notebook, only a calm expression that never seemed forced, despite the hour. At 28, Naomi had worked at the Castellano estate for less than 2 months. Most of the household staff barely knew her beyond polite greetings exchanged during breakfast preparations or afternoon cleaning schedules. She rarely spoke unless spoken to. She never lingered after finishing her work. She had mastered the quiet rhythm of invisibility, moving through marble hallways with gentle confidence, as though she understood that true kindness rarely announced itself. Mrs. Eleanor was already awake. Moonlight spilled across her silver hair as trembling fingers clutched the edge of her blanket. Her frightened eyes searched the room with heartbreaking urgency. "Thomas," she whispered into the darkness. "Thomas, where are you?" The question floated through the room like a prayer no one had answered in years. Naomi stepped closer without startling her. She knelt beside the bed until their eyes met. The elderly woman's breathing remained uneven, but she did not pull away. Naomi offered only the smallest smile before softly taking the fragile hand resting atop the blanket. Then she began to sing. It was not a famous hymn or a polished performance meant for applause. It was an old spiritual her grandmother had sung during sleepless nights back in Georgia, carried through generations by voices that believed hope could survive even when memories could not. The melody drifted gently through the bedroom, wrapping itself around every antique photograph, every curtain stirred by the summer breeze, every fading memory that refused to disappear completely. Mrs. Eleanor's shoulders slowly relaxed. The panic faded from her eyes one breath at a time. Her fingers, moments earlier trembling with fear, gradually settled around Naomi's hand. Within minutes, the lines of worry softened across her face, and her breathing found a peaceful rhythm no prescription had ever achieved. Standing beyond the partially open doorway, Dominic Castellano watched without moving. At 6'3", dressed in a tailored white shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly above his forearms, he appeared as composed as always. To anyone else, he would have looked completely unreadable. But tonight marked the 42nd consecutive night he had quietly taken the same position outside his mother's room. 42 nights of watching the same young housemaid appear at exactly 3 o'clock. 42 nights of hearing the same gentle song calm the woman who no longer remembered raising him. 42 nights of asking himself a question he had never found the courage to speak aloud. Why would someone keep returning when no one expected her to? Naomi never knew he was there. She never looked toward the hallway. She never searched for recognition. Every morning, once Mrs. Eleanor had fallen asleep, she carefully tucked the blanket beneath the older woman's shoulders, whispered, "Sleep well, Miss Eleanor," and slipped back into the quiet darkness before dawn painted the mansion windows gold. Tonight, however, something changed. As Naomi reached to smooth a loose strand of silver hair away from Mrs. Eleanor's forehead, The elderly woman gently squeezed her hand with surprising strength. Her cloudy eyes focused with unusual clarity. For one brief, impossible moment, they reflected recognition. A faint smile touched her lips as she whispered words that stopped the world outside the bedroom door. You finally found her, my son. Don't let this one disappear. Dominic Castellano did not sleep after those words. Long after Naomi quietly closed the bedroom door and disappeared into the silent corridor reserved for household staff, he remained standing beside his mother's bed, studying the peaceful expression that had become almost impossible to witness over the past 2 years. Eleanor slept with one hand resting lightly where Naomi had held it only moments earlier, as though the warmth of that simple gesture had lingered after the song had faded. Dominic had spent millions of dollars searching for treatments. He had converted an entire wing of the estate into a private medical suite. Neurologists visited every month. Memory specialists came from the country's finest hospitals. Music therapists, cognitive experts, nutritionists, and caregivers had all promised progress. Some offered hope. Others offered statistics. None had ever offered peace. Yet every night, a young housemaid earning an ordinary salary walked into the room with nothing except kindness, and somehow accomplished what no expert ever had. As dawn slowly painted soft shades of gold across the eastern windows, Dominic made his way downstairs toward the kitchen. The estate was beginning to wake. Bakers prepared fresh bread. Coffee filled the air with its familiar aroma. The house staff greeted one another with quiet smiles before beginning another carefully organized day. Naomi stood near the large farmhouse sink, washing fresh blueberries for Mrs. Eleanor's breakfast exactly as she had every morning since accepting the position. She hummed almost absent-mindedly while working, unaware that the melody was the same one she had sung only hours earlier. Dominic watched unnoticed for a moment. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance. Her dark curls were neatly tied back beneath a simple scarf. Her uniform was spotless but modest. She wore no expensive jewelry, no designer accessories, no sign that she worked inside one of the wealthiest homes in New York. She looked exactly like someone who took pride in doing ordinary things with extraordinary care. Mrs. Alvarez, the head housekeeper, noticed Dominic first and immediately straightened. Every conversation inside the kitchen stopped. "Good morning, sir," she said softly. Dominic nodded politely before asking a question no one expected. "How long has Naomi been working here?" Mrs. Alvarez glanced toward the young woman before answering. 7 weeks, sir. Excellent attendance. Never late. Never complains. Volunteers for extra shifts whenever someone becomes sick." Dominic remained silent. Mrs. Alvarez hesitated before adding, "There is something unusual, though." Dominic looked at her. "She never asks for overtime pay when she stays with your mother. We have tried to add it to her paycheck several times. She always requests that we remove it." Dominic's eyes shifted toward Naomi, who continued preparing breakfast without realizing the conversation concerned her. "Why?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Alvarez smiled with genuine admiration. "She says kindness should never feel like a business transaction." The words settled heavily inside Dominic's mind. Throughout his career, every agreement had carried conditions. Every favor created obligation. Every signature demanded something in return. That was how powerful people survived. Yet Naomi seemed to live by an entirely different set of rules, ones that expected nothing back. A few minutes later, she carried Mrs. Eleanor's breakfast tray toward the elevator, carefully, arranging the fresh fruit, warm oatmeal, and a single white rose clipped from the estate's garden. She nearly passed Dominic before realizing he stood beside the doorway. Her eyes widened slightly. "Good morning, Mr. Castellano," she said respectfully. "I hope I am not in your way." Dominic looked at the tray before meeting her calm brown eyes. "My mother likes white roses." Naomi smiled gently. "She used to stop by the garden every afternoon. Mrs. Alvarez mentioned it during my first week. Even if she forgets everything else, sometimes familiar beauty helps the heart remember before the mind can." Dominic found himself speechless. Naomi simply offered a polite nod and continued toward the elevator, leaving behind only the faint fragrance of the rose and another quiet reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of attention revealed the deepest forms of love. That evening, the estate settled into its familiar rhythm. Luxury always looked effortless from the outside, But inside the Castellano mansion, every hour followed an invisible schedule that hundreds of quiet routines kept alive. Fresh flowers were replaced before sunset. The fireplaces were checked twice, even during warmer months. The library lamps were turned on precisely at 7:30. Dinner was served exactly when the grandfather clock chimed 8. Naomi moved through each responsibility with the same quiet precision she brought to everything else, never drawing attention to herself, never expecting praise. Yet for the first time since she had accepted the position, she noticed something unusual. Dominic Castellano seemed to appear wherever she happened to be. He did not speak often. He did not interrupt her work. Sometimes he simply crossed the hallway as she polished a window. Other times he stood near the library shelves pretending to review documents while she arranged fresh flowers nearby. Once she looked up from dusting an antique piano and found him standing outside in the garden, gazing through the glass with an expression she could not quite understand. It was not suspicion. It was not authority. It was curiosity, quiet and patient, as though he were trying to solve a mystery that refused to reveal itself. Naomi assumed he was concerned only about his mother. That thought comforted her because it meant his attention belonged where it should. Shortly before midnight, Mrs. Alvarez approached, while Naomi folded fresh linens in the laundry room. "You may leave after your shift tonight," she said kindly. "One of the overnight nurses has returned." Naomi smiled gratefully. "Thank you. I am glad she is feeling better." Mrs. Alvarez nodded before lowering her voice. "You have done more than anyone expected these past weeks. You deserve the rest." Naomi looked down at the neatly folded blanket in her hands. "I appreciate that. But if Miss Eleanor wakes again, I would rather stay nearby." Mrs. Alvarez sighed softly. "Child, no one would blame you for going home." Naomi answered with the same gentle smile she always carried. "I know. That is exactly why I can stay." A little before 3 in the morning, the familiar sound drifted through the upper hallway. It was not loud. It never was. Just the faint, uncertain voice of an elderly woman calling into the darkness for someone who had been gone many years. Naomi quietly placed the book she had been reading onto the small table beside the staff lounge sofa. She had not gone home after all. She never did on those nights. Without hesitation, she walked upstairs, her footsteps almost soundless against the thick carpet. As she reached Mrs. Eleanor's bedroom, the door was already slightly open. Dominic stood inside beside the window, the pale moonlight outlining his silhouette. For the first time, he did not step away into the hallway when Naomi arrived. Instead, he looked at her directly. She hesitated respectfully. "Would you like me to come back later, sir?" Dominic slowly shook his head. "No, please help her." There was something different in his voice. It carried none of the guarded distance that usually surrounded him. Naomi nodded gently before crossing the room. Mrs. Eleanor's breathing had become uneven again, her frightened eyes searching faces that no longer belonged to the present. Naomi sat beside the bed exactly as she always had. She reached for the older woman's hand and began the familiar melody, soft enough that every note felt more like reassurance than performance. Dominic remained completely still. As the song filled the room, he noticed details he had somehow missed during 42 nights of silent observation. Naomi never closed her eyes while singing. She watched his mother the entire time, adjusting the pace of each verse to match every change in Eleanor's breathing. Whenever the older woman's fingers tightened with fear, Naomi slowed the melody until calm gradually returned. It was not simply a beautiful voice. It was listening wrapped inside music. And as Mrs. Eleanor finally drifted peacefully back to sleep, Dominic understood that what healed his mother every night was not only the song itself. It was the heart of the woman singing it. The following afternoon, an unexpected rain settled over the Hudson, covering the estate in a soft gray silence that seemed to slow time itself. Mrs. Eleanor spent most of the day resting near the sunroom windows, occasionally smiling at birds she believed she had fed decades earlier. Naomi stayed close whenever her regular duties allowed, quietly reading aloud from an old collection of American poetry, even though she was never certain how much Mrs. Eleanor truly understood. Sometimes the older woman listened with peaceful attention. Other times she simply closed her eyes and enjoyed the sound of another human voice nearby. Dominic noticed that as well. He had begun paying attention to things he had overlooked for years. He noticed that Naomi never corrected his mother when she confused yesterday with 50 years ago. If Eleanor believed it was spring, although autumn leaves covered the gardens, Naomi spoke about spring flowers. If she believed her late husband was returning home before supper, Naomi simply smiled and asked what his favorite dessert had been. She never argued with fading memories. She gently walked beside them until fear disappeared. Late that afternoon, Dominic found Dr. Harold Whitmore reviewing Eleanor's latest medical reports inside the private study. The physician had cared for Eleanor since the earliest signs of memory loss appeared. Dominic asked the same question he had asked dozens of times before. Is she improving? Dr. Whitmore carefully removed his glasses before answering. Her illness has not changed. That is the difficult truth. Then why does she sleep peacefully now? The doctor remained thoughtful for several seconds. Medicine can calm the brain. It cannot always calm the heart. Whatever Miss Carter is doing reaches your mother emotionally before it reaches her memory. That is exceptionally rare. Dominic looked toward the rain-covered windows. Can it be measured? Dr. Whitmore smiled gently. Some of the most important things in medicine cannot. That answer remained with Dominic long after the meeting ended. Throughout his life, every important decision had depended upon numbers, contracts, reports, or evidence. Yet there was no chart explaining why one quiet song accomplished more than expensive treatment plans. There was no formula measuring compassion. That evening, Dominic made another unusual decision. He instructed the kitchen staff to prepare dinner for everyone working the overnight shift instead of only the scheduled employees. Naomi nearly protested when Mrs. Alvarez handed her a warm plate before midnight. Mr. Castellano insisted. Mrs. Alvarez explained with a knowing smile. He said no one should care for others on an empty stomach. Naomi looked surprised but accepted the meal gratefully. Please thank him for me. I will. A few hours later, the familiar routine returned once again. The mansion became still. The clocks continued their patient march toward 3 in the morning. Naomi quietly entered Mrs. Eleanor's room, carrying nothing except herself. This time Dominic remained seated in the reading chair near the fireplace rather than standing beside the doorway. He held an old family photograph that had rested on the bookshelf for years. In it, a much younger Eleanor laughed while teaching a little boy how to plant roses in the estate garden. Dominic studied the picture before lifting his eyes toward Naomi as she began singing. Halfway through the gentle melody, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Eleanor slowly opened her eyes and looked first at Naomi, then at Dominic. A faint smile appeared across her face. You finally watered the roses, she whispered softly. They were waiting. Dominic lowered the photograph into his lap. No one else in the room understood why those simple words struck him so deeply. When he was 10 years old, his mother had planted a row of white roses beside the eastern garden and made him promise he would always care for them after she grew old. He had forgotten that promise many years earlier. Naomi had unknowingly placed fresh white roses beside Eleanor's breakfast every morning since her first week, and somehow, through a kindness no one had instructed her to give, she had quietly kept a promise that even her own son had allowed time to erase. The next morning began with a quiet surprise that no one in the mansion expected. Mrs. Eleanor asked for breakfast in the garden. It had been nearly 8 months since she had willingly stepped outside for a meal, and every caregiver had long ago stopped suggesting it after countless gentle refusals. Yet when Naomi pulled back the curtains and sunlight spilled across the room, the older woman smiled like someone greeting an old friend. The roses are waiting, she said softly. We should not keep them waiting. Within half an hour, a small table had been arranged beneath the white pergola overlooking the eastern garden. Morning dew still rested on the rose petals, sparkling beneath the first rays of sunlight. Mrs. Eleanor admired every bloom with childlike wonder, occasionally reaching out to touch a blossom as though greeting someone she had missed for years. Naomi poured warm tea while quietly describing the names of the flowers. She had spent several evenings reading the estate's old gardening journals simply because she wanted to understand the place that had once brought Mrs. Eleanor so much happiness. Dominic watched from the library balcony above without announcing his presence. He noticed something else that morning. Naomi never rushed his mother. If Eleanor wanted 5 minutes to admire a single white rose, Naomi waited beside her without glancing at a watch or thinking about unfinished chores. Time itself seemed slower around her, not because she ignored responsibility, but because she understood that moments of peace could not be hurried. Later, That afternoon, Dominic found Mrs. Alvarez organizing personnel files in the estate office. "There is something I would like to know," he said. Mrs. Alvarez looked up immediately. "Of course, sir. Did Miss Carter ever tell you why she applied to work here?" The older woman thought carefully before opening a small folder. "Only once. During her interview. She said she preferred caring for elderly people because they reminded her of someone she loved very much." Dominic remained silent, waiting. Mrs. Alvarez smiled gently at the memory. "I asked whether she had worked in nursing before. She said no. She simply spent 7 years caring for her grandmother after school, every weekend, and eventually full-time. Her grandmother suffered from memory loss during the last years of her life." Dominic slowly lowered his eyes. "Did she say what happened?" Mrs. Alvarez nodded quietly. "Her grandmother passed away 3 years ago. Miss Carter told me she still sometimes catches herself humming the same songs she used to sing beside her bed." She laughed when she said it, but her eyes became very sad. She said love has a strange way of continuing long after someone is gone. Those words lingered inside Dominic long after the conversation ended. That evening, as twilight settled over the estate, he walked alone toward the eastern garden. The white roses swayed gently in the breeze, filling the air with a fragrance he suddenly remembered from childhood summers. He realized that he could not remember the last time he had stood there without checking his phone or thinking about business. For years he had believed success meant protecting everything under his name. Yet Naomi protected something entirely different. She protected memories. She protected dignity. She protected moments that everyone else considered too small to matter. Just before sunset, he noticed a worn leather notebook resting on the garden bench where Naomi had been arranging fresh flowers earlier. He picked it up, only intending to return it before realizing it had fallen open on its own. There were no private letters, no secrets, no personal photographs inside. Only neat handwritten entries, each dated with quiet consistency. Night 17. She smiled before falling asleep. Night 24. She remembered the roses today. Night 31. She laughed when I finished the second verse. Night 42. She held my hand and called her son home. Dominic closed the notebook gently, his chest unexpectedly heavy. Naomi had not been counting the nights for herself. She had been preserving every small victory for a woman who would never remember any of them the following morning. 3 evenings later, the rhythm that had quietly transformed the mansion suddenly faltered. Naomi arrived for work carrying the same gentle smile she always wore, but Mrs. Alvarez noticed something different almost immediately. Her voice sounded strained, softer than usual, and every few minutes she cleared her throat as though trying to push away an invisible discomfort. "You should let the kitchen prepare tea with honey," Mrs. Alvarez suggested kindly. Naomi smiled. "It is only a little tiredness. I will be fine after some rest." But rest never came. Throughout the afternoon, Naomi continued folding laundry, arranging fresh flowers, reading to Mrs. Eleanor, and helping the nurses exactly as she always had. Not once did she mention feeling unwell. By sunset, she had begun coughing quietly whenever she believed no one could hear. Dominic noticed. He had become far more observant than he realized. During dinner, he watched Naomi excuse herself for only a few seconds before returning with a glass of water. She apologized for the brief interruption, even though no one had complained. Later that evening, he quietly asked Mrs. Alvarez to arrange a medical appointment for her the following morning. Mrs. Alvarez agreed without hesitation. Naomi politely accepted only because she did not wish to appear disrespectful. The examination lasted less than an hour, but when the physician requested to speak privately with Dominic afterward, an uneasy silence settled over the consultation room. Dr. Emily Lawson closed the medical folder before choosing her words carefully. "Miss Carter has early inflammation affecting her vocal cords. Fortunately, it appears treatable, but only if she allows them to heal." Dominic remained composed. "What does that require?" "Complete vocal rest for several weeks," the doctor answered. "No singing. No unnecessary talking. If she continues placing this much strain on her voice every night, recovery could take much longer." Dominic thanked the physician and stepped into the hallway where Naomi sat patiently reading a worn paperback novel while waiting for the appointment to end. She looked up with the same reassuring smile she offered everyone else. "Is everything all right, sir?" Dominic sat beside her for the first time since they had met. "The doctor wants you to rest your voice." Naomi lowered her eyes for only a moment. I understand. You will follow her instructions. Naomi remained quiet. Dominic noticed she did not answer immediately. Finally, she spoke so softly that he almost missed the words. I will try. That evening, the mansion seemed strangely unsettled. Dominic had personally instructed the overnight nursing team to remain with Mrs. Eleanor while Naomi rested in the staff quarters. At 3 o'clock, the familiar cries echoed through the upper hallway once again. The nurses spoke gently. They adjusted blankets. They offered warm tea and calming conversation. Nothing eased the growing fear in Mrs. Eleanor's eyes. She continued searching the room with trembling hands, whispering for people who had long since passed away. Dominic stood helplessly beside the bed. Every solution he knew had failed once again. Then, just as the clock marked 3:15, a quiet melody drifted through the doorway. Naomi stood there wrapped in a light sweater, one hand resting against the doorframe. Her voice was weaker than before, barely louder than a whisper, yet the familiar tune filled the room with the same quiet comfort it always had. Mrs. Eleanor immediately turned toward the sound. Her breathing slowed. Her frightened expression softened. Within minutes, she peacefully closed her eyes and fell asleep. Dominic walked toward Naomi just as she finished the final note. Before he could say a single word, she swayed slightly, catching herself against the wall with visible effort. He reached out instinctively to steady her. Why are you here? He asked gently. The doctor told you not to sing. Naomi looked back toward the sleeping woman inside the room before answering with a tired smile that carried more kindness than sorrow. Because sometimes healing another heart cannot wait until mine has recovered. Dominic did not return to his office after walking Naomi back to the staff wing. Instead, he remained alone in the quiet corridor outside his mother's room, listening to the steady rhythm of Eleanor's peaceful breathing. For the first time in years, he realized that every meaningful change inside this house had begun with someone who held no title, no authority, and no expectation of recognition. Before sunrise, he made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He canceled every meeting scheduled for the following day. His assistants received only a brief message saying that family responsibilities required his attention. By mid-morning, Dominic knocked softly on the door of the small staff lounge where Naomi usually spent her breaks. She looked up from a cup of warm tea, immediately standing out of respect. You do not need to stand, Dominic said gently. Please, stay seated. Naomi hesitated before sitting again. Dominic noticed the notebook resting beside her, the same one filled with quiet records of every small victory his mother would never remember. May I ask you something? He said. Of course, sir. Why did you never tell anyone about the nights? Naomi looked thoughtfully toward the window where sunlight filtered through the old oak trees outside. Because they were never about me. Dominic remained silent, waiting for more. Naomi folded her hands in her lap before speaking again. When my grandmother became ill, people slowly stopped visiting. They always had good reasons. Work became busy. Life became complicated. They promised to come next week. Then next month. Eventually, it was only the two of us. Some days, she forgot my name 5 times before lunch. Other days, she believed I was her sister. I learned that correcting her only made her frightened. Loving her where she was made her peaceful. Dominic lowered his eyes. She continued quietly. The hardest part was not watching her lose memories. The hardest part was watching people believe those memories no longer mattered. Her voice almost disappeared into a whisper. They still mattered to her heart, even when her mind could no longer hold them. The room remained completely still. Dominic felt every word settle inside him with unexpected weight. He thought of the years he had spent searching for impossible cures while overlooking the ordinary comfort his mother had needed most. Naomi looked at him with calm sincerity. Miss Eleanor does not need someone to remind her who she used to be. She needs someone willing to stay beside who she is today. Dominic slowly exhaled. Why continue after the doctor warned you to stop singing? Naomi smiled faintly. Because every night I imagine my grandmother waiting for someone to sing to her after I was no longer there. I cannot change what happened then, but I can make sure Miss Eleanor never waits alone. Dominic felt his throat tighten. All the influence he possessed, every resource available to him, had never taught him a lesson as profound as the one spoken by the quiet woman sitting across from him. He finally understood why his mother had reached for Naomi's hand instead of another prescription. Why the roses mattered. Why the songs mattered. Why 42 nights had become something no amount of money could ever purchase. He stood slowly, but before leaving, he asked one final question. Naomi, if no one had ever discovered what you were doing, would you have continued? She looked at him with gentle surprise, as though the answer had always been obvious. Every night, she replied softly, for as long as she needed someone to remember that she was worthy of being loved. Dominic nodded once without speaking. As he quietly walked back toward the main hallway, the mansion felt different around him. Its marble floors, priceless paintings, and towering ceilings no longer seemed like the greatest treasures under his roof. The greatest treasure had been quietly carrying a song through its halls all along, asking for nothing except the chance to ease one lonely heart. The following week, the atmosphere inside the Castellano estate changed in ways no one could fully explain. Mrs. Eleanor continued asking for Naomi every morning, not because she always remembered her name, but because she remembered the feeling of safety that arrived whenever the young woman entered the room. Some days she believed Naomi was an old neighbor. Other days she introduced her as a cousin from childhood. Naomi never corrected her. She simply accepted every version with the same patient smile. Dominic watched these moments quietly until one afternoon he gathered the entire household staff in the main drawing room, a place usually reserved for family celebrations or important announcements. Housekeepers, gardeners, chefs, drivers, nurses, and assistants stood together in respectful silence, exchanging curious glances. Naomi assumed there had been a change in schedules or new instructions regarding Mrs. Eleanor's care. She remained near the back of the room, hoping not to attract attention. Dominic entered carrying a slim leather folder instead of the stack of business documents everyone expected. His expression was calm, but there was an unfamiliar warmth in his eyes. For years, this house has operated because each of you performs your responsibilities with professionalism, he began. I have always believed that efficiency keeps a home standing. Recently, I learned that I was only partially correct. The room became completely still. A house can stand because of efficiency, he continued, but it only becomes a home because of compassion. His gaze slowly found Naomi among the employees. Miss Carter, would you please come forward? Naomi hesitated before walking to the front of the room. She looked genuinely confused. Dominic opened the folder and removed a single document. 7 weeks ago, you accepted a position here as a housemaid. Your job description never included caring for my mother during the most difficult hours of the night. No one instructed you to sacrifice your sleep. No one required you to sing. No one offered additional compensation because you never allowed it. A quiet emotion spread across the room as several staff members lowered their eyes. Dominic continued speaking with steady sincerity. During those weeks, you reminded my mother that she was never alone. You reminded this household that kindness cannot be assigned by schedule. And you reminded me that the greatest form of strength is often the quietest one. Naomi's eyes glistened, but she remained silent. Dominic handed her the document. Effective immediately, your position within this estate has changed. You will no longer work as a housemaid. Beginning today, you will serve as Mrs. Eleanor Castellano's personal companion and director of comfort care. Your only responsibility will be helping my mother experience every day with dignity, peace, and joy. Naomi looked down at the paper without speaking. Dominic smiled gently. There is one more condition. Naomi looked up with quiet surprise. You will never again refuse compensation for caring for my mother. Because what you have given this family is not something I can repay, but it is something I will always honor. Mrs. Alvarez quietly wiped a tear from her cheek. Even Dr. Whitmore, who had arrived for Eleanor's afternoon visit, smiled with quiet approval. Naomi finally found her voice. Mr. Castellano, I never wanted recognition. I only wanted Miss Eleanor to feel safe. Dominic nodded. I know. That is precisely why you deserve it. At that very moment, the drawing room door slowly opened. Mrs. Eleanor stood there with one of the nurses beside her. She looked around the room until her eyes settled on Naomi. A bright smile crossed her face. There you are, sweetheart, she said warmly. I have been looking everywhere for my sunshine. No one corrected her. No one needed to. Naomi walked over, gently took Eleanor's hand, and together they stepped into the afternoon light pouring through the tall windows, while everyone in the room understood that the most valuable person in the Castellano estate had never been the one who owned it, but the one who quietly filled it with hope. The seasons changed gently around the Castellano estate. Summer roses slowly gave way to brilliant autumn leaves, and then to the quiet stillness of winter, but one tradition never disappeared. Every evening Naomi spent time beside Mrs. Eleanor, reading favorite poems, sharing warm tea, or softly humming the melodies that had become part of the home's heartbeat. Some days Eleanor remembered fragments of the past. Other days she remembered almost nothing at all. Yet she never forgot how Naomi made her feel. Peace became more frequent than fear. Laughter visited the old mansion more often than silence. Even the staff began noticing that smiles had quietly replaced the anxious expressions that once filled the overnight shifts. One crisp December morning, Mrs. Eleanor peacefully slipped away in her sleep with Naomi sitting beside her, gently holding her hand while the first snowfall covered the gardens she had loved for so many years. There was no fear on her face, only the faintest trace of the smile that had become familiar during those months of gentle care. Dominic stood quietly beside the bed for a long time before speaking. "Thank you, Mother," he whispered. Then he looked toward Naomi. "Thank you for bringing her home, even when she could no longer find the way herself." A week later, family, friends, employees, and neighbors gathered inside the estate for a private memorial celebrating Eleanor's remarkable life. Instead of grand displays or extravagant decorations, the room was filled with white roses from the Eastern Garden and photographs spanning nearly 8 decades. Every member of the household attended, not because they were required to, but because Eleanor had made each of them feel like family at some point in their lives. Near the end of the gathering, the family attorney approached Dominic carrying a small wooden music box and a sealed envelope discovered among Eleanor's personal belongings. "Your mother left instructions that this should only be opened after everyone had gathered together." Dominic carefully unfolded the handwritten letter inside. The room became completely silent as he began reading aloud. "My dear son, if you are hearing these words, then I have already forgotten this world and finally remembered heaven. Do not be sad for me. Instead, be grateful for the people who stayed beside me when memory could not. There is someone in this room whom I may not always have recognized by name, but my heart recognized her every single time. If she is standing beside you now, please know that the songs she sang carried me safely through the darkest nights of my life. She reminded me that kindness does not disappear simply because memory does. Please keep her close, because people like her are heaven's way of reminding us what love sounds like." Dominic lowered the letter, unable to speak for several moments. He slowly walked across the room toward Naomi, who stood quietly near the back exactly as she always had, trying not to become the center of attention. Without saying a word, he handed her the music box. Naomi looked surprised. "Sir, this belongs to your family." Dominic gently shook his head. "You became part of this family the moment my mother trusted your voice more than her own memories." Naomi carefully opened the music box. The tiny melody that drifted into the room was the very same lullaby she had sung night after night. Tears quietly filled many eyes throughout the gathering, not because of sorrow alone, but because everyone understood the extraordinary truth hidden inside such an ordinary song. Later that evening, after every guest had gone home, Dominic walked alone into the security office beneath the estate. He opened the archive containing months of surveillance recordings. One folder held 42 separate videos from the upstairs hallway. He deleted every other recording from those weeks, preserving only that single collection. Before shutting down the computer, he renamed the folder with words no one else would ever see. 42 songs that brought my mother home. He closed the screen, looked toward the quiet hallway above, and finally understood that the greatest inheritance his mother had left him was not the estate, the fortune, or the family name. It was the courage to recognize that the strongest people are often the gentlest ones, and that the world will always remember what true dignity looks like.